Welcome to the Mental Health During COVID-19 series, offered as a free Facebook Live series through Columbia International University. I'm Dr. Steve Johnson, the director of the Master's Degree Program in Addictions Counseling and the president of the Albert Ellis Institute. Today, I'm going to be looking at how we can overcome loneliness during COVID-19. First, let's kind of zero in on a definition for loneliness. Often, we say that loneliness is kind of the subjective experience that occurs when we feel that there's a gap between the social connections that we would like to have and those that we think we actually have in the present. Loneliness then is based upon the perception that we have of that gap. Another important fact about loneliness is that it's more about the quality of the relationships that we currently have than how many relationships or the quantity of the relationships. We've all had the experience perhaps of being lonely within a crowd or even being surrounded by family and friends, and at times feeling lonely. However, loneliness can be either helpful or harmful. Loneliness is helpful if it's just a passing event, and because if it's a passing event, it may actually function to motivate us to do something about the loneliness, to motivate us to seek out relationships that we might predict to be pleasurable. However, if loneliness is chronic, occurring multiple times over a longer period of time, it can produce very negative health effects, both physical, mental, and emotional. We'll get into that a little bit later. But I do want to say right up front what I'm going to be covering in this presentation. One is how widespread is loneliness, either before COVID-19 within the United States and even during COVID-19. What are the important health consequences of being lonely, especially over that long period of time, as I've just mentioned? The impact that COVID-19 has had on an already significant problem with loneliness prior to the experience of COVID-19. Another topic will be the various types of loneliness, because not every episode of loneliness is of the same type, okay? And then who is struggling with loneliness the most within our culture today, and who is at most risk for experiencing problematical forms of loneliness. So first, what's the prevalence of loneliness? How widespread, in other words, has loneliness been prior to COVID-19 and now actually during COVID-19? So if we go back about to 2017, so roughly 3 years before COVID even entered the scene in the United States, a former U.S. Surgeon General called loneliness a public health epidemic. So already there was a high problematical nature for loneliness within the United States. In the following year, in 2018, a report came out by the Henry J. Kaiser Family Foundation that found 22% of American adults said that they often or always felt lonely. In that very same year, in the United Kingdom, loneliness was experienced as such a problem, so problematical that the country appointed a minister for loneliness to begin to address that problem. And then in 2019, according to Cigna health insurance study, found that 61% of Americans felt lonely. So we see this upward trend in the prevalence of loneliness, but even 3 years before loneliness ever entered, before COVID entered the scene, there was a high prevalence of loneliness within American and Western European culture. What are the consequences of loneliness? I mean, why worry about loneliness? Maybe loneliness is just a part of the fabric of life and that we just have to deal with it and it's not problematical. Well, that's not the case. Research has found that health risk due to loneliness, especially chronic loneliness, are quite great. So, for example, loneliness as a health risk is greater than smoking 15 cigarettes per day, which is an enormous number of cigarettes. It's greater than being an alcoholic as a health risk, or even greater than obesity, which is a tremendous health risk. Chronic loneliness, which causes considerable stress, results in the body being chronically in this state of high alert, of a fight or flight mode nearly all the time. And this contributes to chronic inflammation. In fact, the cortisol, which is the stress hormone produced by the body, has huge negative impacts over the long haul, such as a tendency towards stroke or cardiac problems, diabetes, and the suppression of the immune response, which is tremendously important if we need our immune system to be in top-notch shape if we contract COVID-19, okay? COVID. So also, those individuals who are most experiencing loneliness are 7 times, I mean, this is huge, 7 times more likely to meet the diagnostic criteria for having moderate to severe depression. And with severe depression and even moderate depression, there is an upswing in the incidence of suicide. We have to assess for suicide in the presence of severe depression. So this is to be taken. Loneliness is to be taken seriously. Now, not all loneliness is the same. There are different types of loneliness, and it's very interesting that different types of loneliness are experienced by different types of individuals or different groups of individuals. So the first kind of loneliness is what we would call psychological or interpersonal loneliness. This is kind of expressed in the form of a question of do I have a friend out there? Do I have someone? Do I have someone I can talk to about my problems or my concerns in COVID-19, right? So that's kind of at a personal level, psychological or interpersonal level. But there's also kind of an existential loneliness. This is a broader, in some ways more vague kind of loneliness that is very problematical. It is kind of the question, do I fit in well in this universe? Or does my life have any meaning or purpose? And I want to point out that this kind of existential loneliness has a greater incidence among the 18 to 24-year-old group. That, which happens to be, in the United States at least, the loneliest group in the United States. That's the 18 to 24-year-olds are the loneliest group within the United States. That percentage of loneliness in that group has just escalated in the last few years. We previously thought that loneliness was a problem of the elderly, and now this 18 to 24-year age group has surpassed the percentage of those experiencing loneliness. And then there's what we would call societal loneliness. This is kind of the question, if I enter a room, is my arrival both anticipated and felt or am I insignificant to those around me? And so numerous factors contribute to this kind of societal loneliness. We see societal loneliness greater with respect to certain races, class, as we will see later, and even sexual orientation. The LGBTQ community has a greater sense of societal loneliness. Okay. All of that said, those three types of loneliness, who is at greatest risk for developing loneliness? It's serious forms of loneliness. Well, the risk factors that contribute to an individual developing loneliness prior to COVID-19 were well known. Those were very clear. Those who were young adults, women had greater incidence, reported a greater incidence of loneliness prior to COVID-19. Those with lower educational levels and lower income, those who were economically inactive, who were not working or didn't have a job at the time. Of course, people who were living alone, and urban residents, more the city dwellers than those in more rural areas. Those who were at greater risk or at heightened risk of loneliness during COVID-19 were the 18 to 20 year old age group, right? Very high incidence of loneliness. Those who were in households that have lower income, and adults who were living alone. So those are the three groups that are having the most problems with loneliness during COVID. You would think that with the rise of technology in the American culture and Western culture in general over the last few decades, that that would help overcome loneliness. Paradoxically, though, in an age when we can use technology to connect with others, loneliness has significantly increased rather than decreased. Social media, which clearly has the potential to connect people with others who share similar interest, also heightens the possibility of disagreements. The anonymity of individuals with social media permits us to express views in a much more aggressive and divisive way than if we were face to face. So there's also an upswing in loneliness due to technology. In fact, even in technology, we see people dividing into tribes. Tribal loyalty becomes really important. But simply because they have found a tribe and they're in it, they're not necessarily happier. And in fact, anxiety and depression have increased, especially during COVID-19. And as a result, we see an upswing again, as I said, in the incidence of suicide during COVID-19. Very interesting fact about loneliness is that lonely individuals tend to get lonelier. And so those individuals who were lonely before COVID-19 are even lonelier during COVID-19. Unfortunately, lonely people often don't want to reach out to others. And we'll talk about that a little bit later because it's problematical. And even in those areas of the country where businesses have reopened and we thought that, wow, that would help overcome loneliness, we have seen that even in the presence of that reopening of businesses, that disagreements among friends and family have family members about the meaning, about masking, social distancing, politics, all of those kinds of things have resulted in lonely individuals becoming even lonelier in the presence of other people. So, business openings don't seem to be the magic panacea of overcoming loneliness. Also, we see another interesting phenomenon that during COVID-19, there's this sense that we are too close to some people and we're too disconnected or too far apart from others. COVID has created a situation, in other words, when we feel we feel too close to individuals, right? We more than ever, we see the other individual as potential threat. I mean, I know I've been in a pharmacy where there's a sign on the outside that says mask required. And then when I go in there with my double mask, and someone walks in, then I immediately feel quite negative, and I feel very distant to those individuals and go, what right do they have to put me at risk? So I experience a social distancing from some individuals based on attitudes toward masking in that particular incident. So for them, I would feel too close. On the other hand, for some friends and some family members, I feel too distant, disconnected. So this kind of an interesting phenomenon that's related to this and a contributor to loneliness has been around what I call kind of a term that I coined called friendly associates. These are not close friends or family members, but individuals who may be attached to things that we value. For example, my favorite waiter or waitress at a restaurant that I tended to frequent, that now I don't see anymore, or a regular barista where at my favorite coffee shop, or any number of places, the guard at the gate as I go to my place of employment. Though that whole group of individuals is essentially been eliminated in my life. And while I wasn't terribly close to those individuals, they were pleasant and pleasurable interactions that seem to have been eliminated for many of us. And that increases loneliness. Another one is our emotions about the fact that we are experiencing loneliness. There are some individuals who are embarrassed and ashamed about the fact that they're lonely. But however, if you feel embarrassed or ashamed about loneliness, that's going to contribute to social isolation that intensifies the problem. So it would be helpful if we could begin to address those unfortunate emotions that in some individuals, not all, have that are associated with loneliness. Now, I know I've painted a pretty dire picture up to this point, but it's not all dire. Some real interesting research has come out lately that shows, this research, as I said, this recent research has studied what we would call personal well-being. And they looked at personal well-being in terms of 6 different aspects of life during COVID-19, or 6 different factors in life during COVID-19. So one was level of happiness and satisfaction with life. Frankly, during COVID-19, happiness and life satisfaction has decreased very significantly. The second factor was mental and physical health. Again, that factor decreased significantly during COVID-19. Meaning and purpose in life. This decreased, but not as significantly as happiness, life satisfaction, and mental and physical health. So it didn't go down as much as we would have thought. Character and virtue decreased a little bit. The self-attribution of character and virtue and of others, it did decrease, but not very significantly. And close social relationships, it decreased, but not as much as we would predict. However, although overall, on an average, it didn't decrease as much as we might have predicted, the variability, in fact, that means those who either it decreased really significantly or those that it didn't decrease very much or not at all, is quite varied. So there's a lot of differences in that in close social relationships, or our sense of having significant close social relationships. Financial and material stability was the sixth aspect or factor of life during COVID-19, and that decreased more significantly than any other factor. Now, a couple of things to note. One about that study, which is just very interesting and informative, is it's important to note that some people during COVID-19 have used this time to reevaluate their lives and their priorities in life, and actually trying to give meaning and acquire meaning to life, meaning and purpose in life in the midst of COVID-related challenges. In fact, it has sparked many people to reevaluate life. It also should be noted that our perception of why we are lonely has shifted from prior to COVID-19 and to during COVID-19. In fact, many people prior to COVID-19 would say that they were lonely because people around them didn't like them. That's not so prevalent as a factor in determining loneliness. Right now, we tend to see ourselves as alone and fighting this big common enemy called COVID-19. And I think there's some more research that needs to be done in that area, because being alone, fighting a common enemy may have increased tribalism, which may also in some ways have created closeness but caused division among those who were close. So it's that one would be really worth looking at a little bit more. Okay. What about theories about loneliness? Well, some research has suggested fairly strongly that we may be genetically predisposed. Some people may be genetically predisposed to a level of distress that gets activated when they feel socially disconnected. That may just be built right in our genetic makeup. Secondly, there is research to suggest that lonely individuals approach social situations with more, I guess the word would be more cynicism and mistrust. Those are thoughts, right? So they enter into social relationships expecting rejection, having lower self-worth, more self-consciousness. They're very much aware of themselves and how they perceive others are responding to them. They tend to blame themselves for social failures. I mean, we all have social failures, but not all of us blame ourselves. Some people blame the other, but people who experience loneliness tend to blame themselves. And they also adopt behaviors when they're lonely. They adopt behaviors that increase the possibility of social rejection, right? Maybe they don't talk, or maybe they don't even hang around individuals, right? So they're isolating in the presence of individuals, which will increase their rejection in social situations. Okay. And this also causes them to be pushed to the periphery of social interactions, and this reinforces loneliness. So they're anticipating getting rejected. They act differently because of that anticipation. That behavior shifts them to the periphery of social connectedness and social interactions, which reinforces their loneliness. And so we get this vicious cycle that is established there then. A key factor in that is that, and this is a very important one because it is helpful for us to develop plans for overcoming loneliness. This key factor is that lonely individuals think and act differently than when they're not experiencing loneliness. Okay? That said, that is crucial to understand what we can do about loneliness. To date, there have been major interventions or major models to help individuals overcome loneliness and to increase their effectiveness in overcoming loneliness. So one of one of the early ones was to help individuals improve social skills. So like social skills training. That did help somewhat, but it had limited effectiveness. Why? Because the research findings show that most people who experience loneliness do not have a deficit of social skills. They're quite adept and have social skills. So while giving social skills might be helpful, many people don't have a deficit of social skills. A second model was trying to enhance social supports. So look at ways that individuals who are lonely can be supported and to help them overcome loneliness. Again, this was somewhat helpful, but it had limited effectiveness, in part because many people have social supports but don't use those social supports or don't rely upon those social supports. So it'd be really helpful to find out why they don't. A third model is to give increased opportunities for some kind of social interaction. This is somewhat helpful, but again, has limited effectiveness. Why? Because it was found that we can give individuals a greater number of situations and opportunities for social interaction, but some people do not take advantage of those, which would increase their loneliness. So it would be really helpful to find out why. And then finally, the fourth model was to identify, challenge and change maladaptive, or what would be unhelpful social cognitions. Those would be thoughts about being connected with other people that result in increased loneliness. So if we have kind of unhelpful kinds of thinking styles and unhelpful thoughts that increase loneliness, they found that if we identify those and change them, that was the most helpful mechanism for decreasing loneliness. So that is why it is very important, why kind of cognitive counseling is an excellent choice for a coherent approach to decrease loneliness. Since loneliness is to a large degree determined by inadequate thinking styles. So what would be a kind of a cognitive model that could be used to help address those maladaptive or unhelpful social cognitions or ways of thinking? Well, one is what we call an ABC model. And in that model, loneliness would be seen as, the kind of emotional response, often associated with depression and anxiety as symptoms, as research finds. Lonely people are predisposed toward anxiety and depression. And it was found that there are 4 major kinds of negative thinking or really unhelpful thinking that contribute to it. One would be what is called demandingness. Demandingness, it means the way we're thinking, not that we're voicing demandingness, but we're thinking in demanding ways. So thoughts such as, I must have a guarantee that I will not get rejected. Well, you don't get such a guarantee, but if you think you must have that guarantee and you can't get it, that's going to increase loneliness. Or the relationships that I value must be fully satisfying for me and those individuals must be supportive. Again, having that demand may not correspond to reality, and yet if we have that demand and reality doesn't reflect that, then we set ourselves up for increased loneliness and even the depression and anxiety that are associated with it. Or, I shouldn't have to experience social isolation during COVID-19. A lot of people, there are some people that believe that and put themselves and others at risk, but thinking that they shouldn't do it may, even if they don't put themselves at risk, the thought that I shouldn't have to experience social isolation can contribute to loneliness. So that what we would call demanding, this type of thinking. Another one would be awfulizing. This would be thoughts like, it's terrible when I have to work so hard to connect with others. It's terrible, it's horrible, it's awful that I have to do that. Or it's horrible that I've lost being around family members and close friends. Well, it's not so much thinking that that's awful that is problem. It is if you spend a lot of time thinking how horrible it is. That means sitting on the couch and going over it and over it and over it. So just having the thought occasionally, no problem. That's going to be normal and not terribly disruptive. But ongoing and persistent thinking of those thoughts will not be helpful. Frustration, what we call frustration intolerance. This would be like a thought, I can't stand being alone, right? Well, it is uncomfortable being alone for many individuals, but to exaggerate it up to I can't stand it, one is not the truth and it's not realistic. They're standing it. They're just making themselves miserable about it. Or it's too much to be confined to my home by myself. Again, really unpleasant. But when we have that thought that I can't stand it or that it's too much, it increases dysfunctional emotions. Or another one, and the final one would be kind of global negative rating. I'm such a loser because I don't have the relationships that I want. That would be a global negative rating of the self, putting the self down, which is never helpful. Or people just don't care about anyone but themselves. They're just utterly self-centered. I'm not putting the self down, but I'm putting others down. But if you're putting others down in that global way, again, that's dysfunctional. Or the world is just a cold, lonely, meaningless place. Well, we're not putting the self and others down, but we're putting the world down. Or my life is worthless and without value when I'm all alone. So again, putting the self and others and life and the world down may seem pretty normal. We're not saying that it's abnormal, but really those kinds of thinking are not helpful at all. So one of the things that we can do when we think those kinds of thoughts is argue against them. First, catch yourself thinking those thoughts, right? And that's going to take just paying attention to what you're thinking. And you can always use how you're feeling. If you're starting to feel down, check what you're thinking when you're feeling down and see if you're engaging in one of those 4 types of thinking that I just mentioned. And one very basic question you can ask yourself when you catch yourself thinking that is, how is it helpful for me to think this? How is it helpful for me to say that I'm a loser because I'm all alone? How helpful is it for me to say that I shouldn't have to be going through this, or it's awful that I am? I mean, again, those are all normal, but they're just not helpful. There's nothing mentally ill with someone who necessarily thinks that. I mean, there are people with mental and emotional problems that do think that way, but people without mental and emotional problems can think in those dysfunctional ways and set themselves up for feeling intense loneliness and experiencing depression and anxiety in the presence of them. So one of the things that we do when we catch them and we are aware that we're engaging in that kind of negative thinking is then try to change it. So instead of demanding us the shoulds, the oughts, the must, and the have tos and the needs, is replace those with desires and wishes and wants. I wish, I didn't have to socially isolate. I wish I didn't have to wear a mask and avoid crowds and all those kinds of things. But that's the way it is right now. So we're wishing it, wanting it, desiring it. So it's more preferential language than demanding language. And if we prefer something rather than demand it, we might be disappointed, but not as distraught. Same thing with awfulizing. Rather than persistently thinking that something is terrible, horrible, and awful, is to go, I don't like this. I mean, who would like to be socially isolated and have to put a mask on when you go out in public and be conscious of how far away you are from people? But to say that it's terrible and horrible and awful, normal, but again, not helpful. What do you want to put in its place? Recognize that it's not fun. Recognize that it's bad and it's uncomfortable. But don't exaggerate it up to totally awful and taking away all meaning, purpose, and potential happiness in life. Frustration intolerance, when we believe that this is terrible, horrible, and awful. Yeah, catch that and then try to change it. Well, what do we want to change it to? Acknowledge that you don't like it. Let's don't play a game and go, oh yeah, it's all wonderful to be, to have to isolate and all of those kinds of things. Acknowledge that it's bad and that you don't like it, but don't exaggerate it. You can tolerate it. Again, but recognize that it's bad. And then the other thing, instead of globally rating the self and others and life and the world, accept it. Accept yourself right now. Accept that, maybe in COVID-19 you experience more frustration, maybe have more anxiety and worry. Give yourself a break. You're a human, and you're going through, along with so many other people, you're going through something pretty big, right? And so don't rate yourself. Don't rate yourself at all. Just accept that is the way you are right now. Same thing with others. A lot of people are doing the best they can. And even if they aren't, humans can disturb themselves. We all can. And so cut them some slack too. Or the world may be challenging, more challenging now than it was before. And my life may even be more challenging. There may be less pleasure in some aspects of my life now, but that doesn't mean that they're devoid of value or meaning or purpose, etc. Okay? So changing our thinking, not to the power of positive thinking, but the power of realistic kinds of thinking. Okay, so that's one of the major things that we can do. Catch and change those unhelpful ways of thinking. Again, all normal, but unhelpful. There are other things that you can do that, even if only partially effective in reducing loneliness, do in conjunction with changing loneliness can produce really good results. One of those is physical activity, to the degree that you can. Right? If you're in a crowded area, put a mask on. Go outside. Walk. Whatever. Go outdoors. Sometimes just going outside, whether you're exercising or not, can be of great relief, and you're not cooped up in the in your house. Third, use technology, but not too much. Use technology. I mean, I know my mother, who's 89 years old, gets on Facebook and enjoys connecting with people with whom she wouldn't otherwise be able to connect. That's good, but if she's on there way too much, then that will not be helpful. In fact, we have some people who are almost showing some addictions to social media or gaming or something like that. By the way, that's going to be another in this series that I'll be looking at, those kinds of behavioral addictions. Another one is join a virtual group. There have been book clubs, all kinds of social interaction done virtually, and that can be a help. Maybe not exclusively, but as part of a combination of activities that an individual can do. Reach out to others. That one is so important. Call them. Check on somebody who may be, really socially isolated you, if not more, and reaching out to them and having some pleasant conversations with them. Rethink your work hours. Part of the problem with COVID has been many people are working at home, and there's not a real clear line of demarcation between work hours and recreation. And so one bleeds into the other, one day bleeds into the other, and it seems like just constant work with no pleasure involved. So separate those hours. Have a clear line of demarcation, right? Take control of your life a little bit more. Separate work and leisure. Create some short self-statements that you tell yourself. So for example, on my computer, I have a screensaver that says, this is just a hassle, not a horrible thing. And so when I see that, then I go, yeah, that's true. And so a short phrases that you can tell yourself. It's better if you make them up rather than just adopt them from somewhere else. Create a daily schedule that includes reaching out to others, pleasure, and work. In other words, live a balanced life. Because COVID has unbalanced the life that we knew, and so let's create a new balance in the midst of COVID. The other one is to engage in stress reduction activities. This can be things like meditation. There are religious forms of meditation, and there are other forms of meditation that can be really, really helpful. The mindfulness kinds of things, that when you do something, be very aware of what you're doing. So, for example, if you're eating, eat mindfully. Pay attention to what you're eating. Many of us, when we're stressed out, shovel the popcorn or whatever it is, the candy bars or whatever, in our face, but we're not real mindful of taste or any of those kinds of things. In fact, that's one that I'm working on. I really use morning as a time to get in touch with different kinds of coffee and enjoy the different taste and all of that. My wife does the same thing with tea. She's trying to lure me into that. I'm holding fast to my coffee, but she tells me that she has the same experience, just savoring that experience and stretching out that pleasure. There are certain kinds of moving meditations that, if consistent with your values, there are some people with certain kinds of religious proclivities or persuasions that don't find these consistent with their beliefs or values, so don't do them. But for others who find this consistent, they might find it very helpful. Things like Tai Chi or Qigong or yoga. My physician, since I'm older, and I was having some trouble with balance, said, Steve, try Tai Chi. I do. It doesn't have any religious significance for me, but when I do it, I found not only does it help with balance, but it's very, very, very relaxing, for me. Or a hobby. This is a great time to kind of do something that you wanted to do, but you never felt like you had the time. I know my older daughter, who's a mental health practitioner, used it as a time to start painting, artistically, and just really has enjoyed it, and starts cooking, doing gourmet cooking, and really is kind of enjoying that. The other thing is give yourself permission to focus on short-term goals as much as those long-term goals. Because one of the things that we find, those individuals who are overly focused on long-term goals and don't have really short-term or moderate range goals, don't get to experience the pleasure of accomplishment. So have some short-term goals, even during COVID-19. Some things that you would like to do, get it out of the way, whether it's cleaning the house, rearranging, whatever it is in your life that you might be able to use as a short-term goal. I developed a short-term goal to learn how to edit videos and add music and stuff to that. I'm not great at it, but I really have enjoyed that. And then the other one is so, so crucial, and that is accept yourself unconditionally when you're not at your best. I mean, we are all quite stressed out, and so it is important to lower that stress, and one of the ways to do it is just to accept yourself unconditionally. It doesn't mean you like everything about yourself, but just accept that you're going through a rough time, and don't beat yourself up. It will get you nowhere good to beat yourself up. So what I hope is we've looked at several factors associated with loneliness, but some things that we can do to help decrease the loneliness. And so what I'm hoping that you will do is that you will experiment with some of those things that I mentioned without demanding that they all have to work equally well. You're just trying them out. It's kind of an experiment in life, trying them out to see what works for you, and you're taking charge of your loneliness. That said, if you are experiencing any really negative, dark thoughts about harming yourself, or you're deeply depressed or anxious, call 911. go to the nearest hospital emergency room or call the police to get help, okay? All kinds of help that are available. You don't have to do that alone. So please take care of you and have a plan to make life better, even during COVID-19. Thank you for this one, and we will be having 3 more such presentations. All the best.